Hello, my name is Katie Shern and I'm presenting to you today on practices and conditions for place-based working on behalf of the Sport England National Evaluation and Learning Partnership. We've been observing and collecting evidence and insights from a range of places across England who have been adopting a place-based or whole systems approach to tackle physical activity inequalities. And they include the local delivery pilots, the Commonwealth Active Communities, and a range of other place-based approaches. So we know that physical activity inequalities is a complex problem. This means it's a result of multiple interacting influences from the natural and built environment, the rules and regulations which govern how we live and work, whether our friends and families are active, and our wider opportunities in life. Years of research of just looking at how individual interventions have shown that actually it makes little difference to the problems of physical activity inequalities. And so that's why there's a national strategy to adopt a whole of systems or place-based approach to this problem. This is an area rife with jargon, and so we're just going to explain what we mean by a whole systems approach and a place-based approach. A whole systems approach is where there are joined up actions across multiple layers of society. So what that means is stakeholders, from managers, decision makers, policy makers, through to communities and individuals, are working together a shared understanding of the challenge and integrating actions to bring about sustainable long-term change in our systems. A place-based approach differs in its emphasis in the sense that it's really, really strongly rooted in the experience and the local characteristics of a place and the insights of the people who live and work there. So in place-based approaches, we recognise the need for action at a range of system levels outlined in whole systems approaches, but that the potential of each place is influenced by its particular characteristics, the way it is or isn't connected into wider networks, including the social determinants of inequalities. So it follows that each of the place-based approaches or whole systems approaches that we've looked at has been led by the local stakeholders, and so therefore they vary from one to another. But we have also identified some broad patterns based on where people choose to act to tackle the problem of physical activity inequalities, and to a certain extent what they think may be modifiable. By that which means what they think they can change or do something about. And we've described these as three different approaches. It's quite important to note that in reality, there's normally a mix of these going on and they're interacting between them. But for the sake of clarity, we're going to describe them as three different approaches. So the first being integrating physical activity across sectors. The rationale for this is that tackling the problem of physical activity inequalities is beyond the scope of just the leisure and sports sector alone. There's a need to build perhaps priority and value in other policy areas for physical activity, both as a positive for society, but also as a means to tackling other policy agendas such as climate change, obesity, mental health. So in working together with other sectors such as health or education, there may be economies of synergy and scale or pooling of resources to create more comprehensive or even innovative physical activity opportunities. And individuals who experience physical activity inequalities may not use the traditional sport and physical activity leisure or leisure facilities, but may meet with other professionals, for example, in the social services. And these interactions could provide teachable moments or signposting of incentivisation for physical activity. Another practice that we've observed is where the focus starts at the community level. So this is really based on the belief that communities, groups, individuals have the skills and the strengths and the capacities to actually work together to solve problems like inactivity and maintain the well-being of the community. From a methods perspective, this is really rooted in the fact that community groups themselves and individuals are better placed to know and understand what their barriers or enablers to physical activity, and also what solutions may resonate most with them and their friends and family. What makes this a systems approach or place-based approach is that the wider stakeholder group are also connected into and reinforcing the ability of the community to act and to hold the resources and decision-making power locally. And the final practice that we've identified is what we call tackling structural inequalities. This acknowledges that physical inactivity is really strongly linked to people's actual opportunities in life in terms of their working and living conditions. And if we want to make a sustainable change in society for higher levels of physical inactivity, then we need to lend our weight to wider initiatives to try to improve the quality of life for people. Now, this may seem like an intimidatingly tall order for any one sector to try to improve, but I guess this is the point of a whole systems approach. It's not just about one group of people trying to tackle structural inequalities, but it's about lending weight to broader initiatives. We've also highlighted that there are other place-based initiatives to tackle other policy agendas, such as antisocial behaviour or smoking or obesity. And this is the real opportunity when most of those activities are focused at the same types of people in society, actually to pool resources and to challenge those underlying conditions that are the root of all of those societal challenges. Not all of these approaches are equal in the sense that it's easier, although not easy, to implement integrating physical activity across sectors and less easy to really tackle those upstream challenges. But in terms of the likelihood of sustainable impact, we see that pattern reversed. Of course, as I mentioned, the ideal scenario is where these are working in consort. So let's now have a look at not just where to act or what to act on, but how one goes about acting on these in these ways. Really important to highlight that this is about people and about how people act, and the values and the mindsets that people host. Supporting the Place Relationships team, as well as a range of the National Evaluation and Learning Partnership, have been working to identify what are those capacities and capabilities, values and mindsets that enable change. And they are about being open, optimistic, building relationships, empathic, as well as being brave, because system change does involve disruption and it does feel uncomfortable at times, and you need to be resilient to persist. We've also identified a range of cross-cutting conditions, which I'm going to just briefly show on the screen here and then go into some more detail as we explain what they are and why they matter for tackling physical activity inequalities. So the first group may be termed system connections. It's about truly understanding barriers and enablers of physical activity. In doing so, recognising that actually it's a joint problem and we need people to be empowered to make decisions within their sphere of influence and collaborate across organisations. These conditions play out differently when we look at the different practices. So I'm just going to highlight some key examples here, and we will, in future communications, we'll provide more detail and depth and examples to bring these to life. So in terms of integration of physical activity into sectors, what we've seen, for example, in health is that we've understood that people may not want to be physically active because they're afraid of exacerbating conditions. So, or in employability, that people are concerned to be seen to be able to move. This has had both perceived and real impacts on their benefits. So you can see that action in these sectors isn't just about coming up with innovative solutions for physical activity, but actually to stop some practice which is inhibiting. If we look at strengthening community and individual capacities, this, as we've mentioned before, is about really listening to local people. And the key thing to highlight here is to entrust the community and to empower them with resources, decision-making, remunerate them for their time in order to lead on behalf of the community. We've also highlighted that years of enforced competition between small voluntary sector organisations mean that there are some conflicts in these local areas, which need to be overcome through innovative commissioning tactics. And then finally, in terms of tackling structural inequalities, the real key here is that people understand that the lack of progress on physical activity inequalities may be due to those structural inequalities, that poor living and working conditions lead to a lack of dignity and a sense of control in one's lives, and ultimately reduction in intrinsic motivation to be active. So this involves dialogue and multi-stakeholder action to distribute power and resources. So let's move on now to our next set of conditions. And these really are about ways of working and also about innovations across the system. I'm going to explain them using the different practices again. So what we've highlighted is that the workforce, although they might see a need to work differently, they're sort of busy doing their day job. And so we've seen examples of strengths-based training to build confidence and mutual understanding across diverse teams. We've also seen that it's not enough just to want to work differently. Actually, a lot of our financial accountability, HR, IT systems are organised in our sector silos, and that prevents us from doing really good collaborative work. And so we've seen examples of where more responsive, agile, flexible systems are proposed. And finally, we've seen that just providing lots of new opportunities doesn't necessarily tackle inequalities in access. And so the centrality of inequalities and person-centred decision-making is key. Thinking about how these conditions play out against the strengthening communities' individual capacities, what we've seen is some really innovative work in local areas, which is actually building the capacity of the local community to lead. And that's in things like governance, in marketing and in valuation, that just building those skills so that the communities themselves can take ownership and lead on behalf of their colleagues, friends and peers. When we think about what these conditions mean when we're tackling structural inequalities, is to see the work, the place-based approach or the whole systems approach as an emancipatory process, by which we mean in and of itself, it actually provides opportunities to the local communities, and that collectively across sectors there's work such that services, amenities and local environments are planned by a range of partners using that person-centred design, but also end up being locally provided for and controlled by communities. Let's now think about the wider environment and in which people find themselves and the centrality of this for conditions to tackle physical activity inequalities. And by this we mean both the culture and the social norms for well-being, and also the physical, both built and natural environment. So in the integration of physical activity into sectors, this is where, rather than just paying lip service to the idea of prevention, it's prioritised and resourced with ring-fenced finance, where we've seen not just the workforce working to help those that they serve to be more active, but the workforce themselves being a captive audience that can be encouraged to be more active and value activity for their own lives. And that the built environment, including these big institutions that a lot of us spend a lot of time in, universities and hospitals, are designed for movement. In strengthening communities and individual capacities, that is really a focus on the social norms and local awareness of the importance of physical activity for happy, healthy lives, but to really work with the local communities with regards to what's appropriate, what resonates for them, and what opportunities and access to environments they would really appreciate. And finally, when thinking about tackling structural inequalities, it's actually really thinking about the broader, wider influences on our ability to be active. So thinking about the safety, the accessibility, the maintenance of the built and natural environments, and also thinking about that local ownership so that people take pride in and can control what is in their local area. Now, the final condition to talk about really is about cycles of learning and action. So we can't underestimate that complexity does mean that we have to accept a great deal of uncertainty in what we're doing and that there's no universal solutions. And that does mean that we have to be adaptive and to learn as we go. And what we've seen is a great deal of work in the local pilot areas and other place-based approaches that prioritises learning and reflective practice about what works and why in local situations. And that's helping people to build up stories as well as numbers which provide explanations and help us improve. So that's the end of the presentation. As you can see, it's a real whistle-stop tour, but we will be providing more information and more examples in the coming weeks. Thank you for listening.